All right. Thank you, everyone. Today we will have a short presentation by Christopher Powell from Toronto Metropolitan University, who is going to be talking to the question, what is radical relationism?
Thanks. I feel so self-conscious. I don't know why. Thanks to everybody for being here. What I wanted to try and do is open things up in a way that hopefully will be a useful model or point of reference, or that didn't work, let's try something else for everybody who comes after me. And what I would like to do to begin with is to upfront frame this conversation in a way that's different from the usual, which is the usual academic norm is implicitly we're aiming for a consensus and we're arguing about what putatively we're all supposed to agree on. And I really would like to approach this in a different spirit, where I want to pose to you a series of questions with the expectation that we're not going to all take the same view, and perhaps even that we can think of our language instead of being, I think this is how things are, or this is what is the case, that we might just think in terms of this is how I frame things, or this is how I conceptualize things, or this is my approach, or this is what I center. And that might be like a convenient linguistic way for us of presenting, differing but potentially connected viewpoints without feeling the need to collapse them into a consensus. Or just, that being said, and I had a whole, can I share the screen? I don't know if
I think so. Do you have the ribbon in the bottom?
I do.
It's a green button.
You
don't have it?
Oh, my computer is doing a strange thing, and yeah, no, okay. I had slides, but they're not going to work. So I'm just going to post things in the chat. And then I'll give us a point of reference. I want to just raise questions along three axes. Instead of a Cartesian axis with 4 lines, think of a triangular 3 lines coming up from a center: ontology, epistemology, and ethics. And I'll start with ontology. And this is going to be the most scholastic I'm going to be, because I've been thinking about these questions in an academic way a long time. And my point of reference is really the literature on relational sociology that's accumulated, that was in the 2-volume collection that Francois and I co-edited, and then also that appears in the literature that's in the Palgrave Handbook of Relational Sociology. There's a very, conventionally academic approach to the question of ontology. So actually, before I dive into that, I want to back up and ask a meta question that should frame all of this, which is, what is all of this for? What do we want to use this for? And I think the answer is going to be different for each of us. Each of us has our own commitments and struggles that we're engaged in. And so I think that's really, that purpose gives us the criteria for evaluating what makes good relational sociology or not, or relationist thinking, I should say. And then so in that context, a lot of academic work on relationism outside of this group has been very much just about doing research, just generating research for, in the conventional, and it's just one more way of opening up interesting research questions. And in that context, people have come up with a bunch of different ways of conceptualizing relationism. So for Pier Paolo Donati, I think relations are one type of social structure among others. And the piece he wrote in my collection was about kind of the rise of relations, in a sense, how there's more relations than there used to be. For Margaret Archer, relations are emergent structures that emerge up out of individual action, and there's very much, for her, a 2-level ontology there. But for somebody like Marx, relations are dialectical processes of sort of creative and productive antagonisms. For Zimmel or for Harrison White, relations are networks of any kind of connectivity that you can imagine. For Bourdieu, relations are relative positions in a field. For Bentley and Dewey, relations are transactions, these processes whereby interactions that transform each of the participants. And all of these are sort of, I don't want to say value neutral, but ideas of relationality that don't have a particular ethical connotation, where a relation could be a good thing or a bad thing. But there's also a lot of people who talk about relationality implicitly as an affirmative connection, that to be a relational thinker doesn't just mean looking at the world and seeing it as some kind of network, but rather a relational thinker is somebody who is thinking and about their relations to others in a responsible, caring, compassionate sort of way. And that's one of the meanings of the word relationality that's out there. And so I'm really curious which of those different ways of thinking about relations resonates, or others that I haven't thought of for each of us. So what is a relation to each of us? How do we think about it? Another dimension that we're all engaged with is the question of epistemology. And I think probably all of us would easily agree that relational thinking leads us to a recognition that all knowledge is situated. I mean, well, I'm curious if anyone would kind of disagree that that if we think of knowledge as constituted through relational processes, then then the classical view of an objective knowledge that could be seen from the God's eye point of view, that sort of goes out the window. But if that goes out the window, then how do we evaluate or validate knowledge? Do we revise our concept of what objectivity means? Do we see knowledge as intersubjectively constituted? Does the concept of reflexivity cover some sort of ground that neither of those other two concepts quite covered? And does it do enough work for us? You know, how do we validate knowledge, and maybe what are the ethical dimensions of that? I'll come back to that. And one other question I want to raise for everybody is, does relationism imply relativism? Like, what's our feeling about that? For me, well, no, I'm not going to say, because I'm just trying to ask questions. And the third area of question I want to raise is radicalism. What do we mean by radicalism? I like to say to students that radicalism and radish have the same etymology, that radicalism is about going to the roots, and radical change is change to the roots. But what roots are we trying to trace or dig up or water? I don't know. In Marxist theory, for instance, there's one root to everything. And then, you know, all of the different oppressions are branches of a tree that has one common root, but not everyone sees the world that way. And are there multiple roots? Or is it one plant? Are there multiple plants? How far can we push that metaphor? And also, do we see ontology and ethics as co-determining each other? Does relational ontology and relational ethics form a necessary package, or is there a more contingent relationship between ontology and ethics? Could be, you know, if you're being a relationist, does that mean that you are attending in a good way, to use that common phrase that a lot of Indigenous people use, to relations in a responsible, accountable, ethical way? Or could somebody be a relational fascist? Could somebody be a relational colonizer? What do you think of that? So those are my three big questions, kind of what is the ontology, what's the epistemology, and what's the politics? And I hope that's given you some ideas. And what I'd really love to hear is people sparking off each other.
Thank you, thank you. Thank you for this introduction, Chris. So there we have it, a small set of questions for everyone to ponder and to think about. I like that structure of ontology, epistemology, ethics, and then did I hear right, Chris? And you talk about ethics interchangeably with politics. So if that's the case,
I did do that. And are they the same or are they different? That's
yeah. And so the floor is open. We have approximately another 10, 15 minutes for those of us who would like to raise a point. And thank you for writing the questions there in the chat. Chris, I see Melody's hand up. Would you like to take it away, Melody?
Yeah, well, I was obviously activated by kind of fascistly relationalists. Obviously, it's just something that I've been thinking about and theorizing the far right in relational ways. And one concept that I've been encountering a lot and that I hope to do more with is this idea of contradiction and being as relational ethnographers, and as Matthew Desmond calls it, okay with sitting within the tensions that our research subjects present to us. And where I'm getting with this is I think that relations are what enable contradictions to be functional in the context of a lot of far right groups or worlds. And what I mean by that is like I'm thinking about trad wives right now. I'm writing this last research section on trad wives, and there's a lot of contradictions that pop up that kind of disturb our typical ideas of fascist groups and the way that we think about fascist groups. Like I've seen neo-traditionalist Christians who veil and find solidarity with Muslim women who veil, even though in a traditional or when we traditionally think of the far right, there's a lot of exclusionism there. And I feel like there's many examples of these weird contradictions. But my point is that, or perhaps I'm developing this point, that these people that are living these worlds that are contrary to what we would deem as reality, evidence-based true things in the world, are doing so via our particular arrangement of relations that constitute their version of reality differently, so that those contradictions aren't actually contradictions to them. They're different opportunities or formative relations. If that makes sense at all. Like, this is stuff I'm kind of trying to flesh out, but we have these very young trad wife ultra traditionalist women finding solidarity with groups that we don't expect, and what do those relations produce, or even what relations enabled that in the first place, between womanhood and technology. So these are the kind of things that I'm thinking about. But regardless, I think that we could say that fascists are relationalists, and that has implications, I guess, for what we think about the politics of relationalism and their potentialities. But obviously, I think they have more productive potentialities than that. So more progressive, productive.
Well, yeah, no, but it's an interesting point of departure here. I see, and I saw Jonathan's hand first before you put it down. Would you like to go first, Jonathan? Do you have a point to this?
Yeah, I was my first thoughts came as a response to Chris, but now listening to Melody as well. Okay, yeah, maybe I'll also throw some quick answers from what I can see of all these questions. These are pretty much everything that we're going to cover over the next few months. But yeah, just to prepare for this, I read through again Chris's great chapter in this book on radical relationism. So maybe a few quick thoughts on ontology and especially on the ethics question. So I think there are kinds of, I ask myself this question, if radical relationism is supposed to be, as Chris put it in the chapters, this kind of, so no residual elements of dualism or substantialism. If I think of radical relationism as this, well, a social ontology, most of all, but if social relations are kind of the answer to the ontological question, then well, what is the ontological question? And from kind of the literature that Chris mentioned, and also the kind of positions that he outlined in the chat, I think relational sociologists have been kind of answering two different ontological questions that it would be maybe good to keep separate. So the first question is the age-old question of like, what is there? And we have a long tradition in sociology of like giving a list of what defines our fields of social facts, so discourses, structures, institutions, and so forth. So the radical relationist answer there would just simply be, there are social relations. Everything that there is a social relation, in which case our project is kind of like a reductionist project or of a reconceptualization of everything there is into relational terms. But the other question, which also has outside of social science, is a long tradition in the history of philosophy, is kind of this question of not what exists, but like how things hang together in the most general sense, like, or the way it's often put is like what grounds what. So how do things depend on other things? And here the radical relationist answer that I kind of have leaned on over the last year or so is that social relations are kind of the ground of all social phenomena, that would whenever we want to explain social phenomena, the why of why things are the way they are should be something to do with social relations. So one view is kind of make a list of things, translate everything into relations, and then another one is kind of explain everything through relations. This allows for like there can be things that aren't relations. Anyway, my definition of kind of radical relationism in this view would be that everything that there is either is a social relation or at least it's grounded in social relations. The way that I just presented, I think you can be like a complete Nazi and still agree to something like that. But I will say that I think if we look at the history of like egalitarian social movements, I think they've always been driven by a kind of understanding about the importance of social relations. There's quite a large literature about justice, about how a literature called relational egalitarianism that's kind of noticed that the people who are actually fighting for justice have always realized that it's not about an equality of things that people attach to people, but a fight for social relations that aren't characterized by domination, oppression, exploitation, and so forth. So I think if we so our political goals, I think kind of egalitarians will be more likely to find the relational position something that they'll gravitate towards. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan, for your intervention. It's very good that we see a lot of hands now. I have up here, I had inserted myself in the speakers list, and then we have Kevin, Zoltan, and Becca. I just wanted to intervene just quickly, not to take too much time, because we have a bit of time left, but not too much. When we talk about the roots that radical relationism has, the same that's not epistemological, it's anyways, the root of the word is the same as that of radish. And it just invoked in me the thinking of Rhizome and Deleuze and Guattari and their ideas that everything is connected in such a way. I would like to propose that also radical relationism, since this is what I'm writing about right now, is not just, because I was talking about relational autonomy, which is something that feminists brought up and said, how important are social relationships to our beingness as persons? But what I'm trying to explain that I am not, this is not necessarily the concept that is useful for the kind of ethics that a radical relationism approach would embrace, is because it doesn't take into account our other than human relations. And that is not just to do with our beloved animals or pets or the animals that we depend on to and plants and the land that we depend on to be alive, but also that we are embodied in individual packages, and I would use then the biological theory of Maturana and Varela to say autopoietic entities, and that links us essentially with the natural environment that we need and are part of and depend on to thrive and survive. And I conceptualize it this way because I don't think that thinking of radical relationality only in terms of our social relations, it doesn't do anything towards those ethics that we need to develop to engage in a better relationship with the world and the natural environment, right? So, yeah, thank you, Melody. Cyber relationalism as well, right? That also, that other part of the societal constructions. But and just to continue on that idea of autopoiesis, the theory of language and how the way in which the languages that we use are alive and structurally coupled to the nervous systems of humans that actually do the languaging. And that is part of that, I think, radical relationality that we need to consider in terms of ethics and how we live in the world today. So the next one's Kevin, please.
I know that Rebecca,
you're cutting off a bit. Yeah. You do some magic there and then it gets better. I don't know what you do.
Is it okay? Can you hear me? No?
I think at the end there. Yeah.
Hello?
I think so.
Hello, yes.
Yeah.
So I was just actually saying that Rebecca had her hand up before me.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, she put it down, but I know that
I didn't.
she put it back up. So no.
Would you like to go ahead, Rebecca? Is there something?
Okay. Please go ahead, Kevin. Please go ahead. Yeah.
So I was just going to say, and just to keep it short, I think one of the things that I see common among some of the core questions, we're talking ontology, epistemology, politics, from a relational point of view, what's the root, when we talk about radical, and for me, it always expressed itself as, so we're actually talking, the question where we end up often asking comes down, we don't use these words necessarily, but it's creative origins or creative force, or there's a question of creation. How do things come into being, and what's the nature of those processes of coming into being? And are those things entities, objects? Are they processes, or is the process what makes it count? And so I feel that it also, in a sense, the question of creativity, and this will probably be the thing that I'm proposing for the book, the question of creativity comes down to how we involve different actors, actants, material, non-material. It ends up, so what are the forces that act on processes of becoming? It also entails a kind of an immediate question of those forces of becoming require a certain ethical, political, inclusive stance. And I think that the example that you gave, Monica, of
your audio is cutting again.
I moved my office and my internet might not be as good as it needs to be.
I'm sorry, I just interrupted you. I think it's going to work.
No, that's it. I feel like in a sense, when it comes down to a lot of these questions, I find them to be a common question of creation and how creation happens.
Thank you. Sorry, Rebecca, you're next, and then Sultan. Sorry, I didn't see your hand.
Thank you so much. Like, I'm just loving this idea of the radish, and I feel like we could play with it for a long time. I love gardening, so I'm thinking about the soil and what happens with the soil and sun and climate change, and oh my gosh, it's just such a great way of kind of starting. But that wasn't where I was thinking of starting. I was thinking of turning upside down. You know, we often start with ontology and we work this kind of deductive way, but I'd also just like to maybe flip it the other way and spend some time with Melody's idea that she raised, and just putting a few questions out there, and linger on the ways in which something like contradiction might be constructed, and just bringing attention back to ideas of sense making and meaning making. So when you pose this example of veiling or covering, and you referred to Islamophobia alongside different particular religious practices and how they at different moments in time are practiced in different ways. So I was just wondering, when you think about the idea of contradiction, is this like your analytical framework where you're saying that these, because I'm just wondering, when you think about trad wives, are they still engaging in substantialist thought? Is there still these ideas of the group, and that it's a particular idea of contradiction, like it's a particular way of saying, critiquing how the meaning making is happening, or bringing in a particular kind of analytical framework to say these two are similar, and on what basis are they similar, and is appealing to similarities and differences kind of paradoxically reinforcing substantialist thinking? So I don't know if that's kind of making sense, but just troubling a similarity and differences approach without kind of paying attention to why they are made to be thought of as similar or different, and who defines the contradiction. Because similarity and difference seems to appeal to a substantialist way of understanding the world, and perhaps obfuscates the very different sense making and meaning making that different people in different ways might be thinking about when they think about a practice. So I'm just taking it back down to that, to the way we live lives, and how that might talk back to an idea of a contradiction, that something is in contrast to something else, and whether contradiction has like substantialist basis to it. And one way of thinking about that is, because how is that frame of meaning making happening? And do we, anyway, sorry, this is just a kind of provocation there to think about.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
I'd love to hear your thoughts, Melody.
Yeah, do you mind if I jump in quickly, or should we go to Zoltan?
Totally. Let's make it more.
When I think of contradiction, I'm thinking of it kind of as a useful term to pull folks in to thinking about politically abject groups in different ways than far-right studies in particular has gone about thinking about them. Typically, there's a tendency to understand people that believe in conspiracy theories, or people that pursue trad wifery as working against themselves or pursuing their own oppression, or that type of thing. And that's kind of what I see as the substantialist thinking, that there is certain types of people that dig their own graves, and it's just a very typical approach in far right studies to overall. So what I feel like I'm trying to do with, and thanks for your engagement, by the way, this is helping me flesh out all of this stuff for, I have to actually do a panel presentation on tradwives next month. So so what contradiction does for me is it allows us to pull in and make obvious the fact that we are viewing their ontological basis in a certain way as these outsiders. And in that sense, taking that substantialist approach. But if we are working to study these folks not by the details of their ideology, but by the features of their practice, aka their ontology, then that means understanding the ways that what we in our ontological purview would understand as contradictory to be actually functional relations within or productive relations within their world space, if that makes sense. So I'm kind of using contradiction as a provocation, I suppose, to highlight the ways that different relations work within different ontologies, maybe, if that makes sense. But it's definitely something to flesh out a bit more. I actually have a roundtable themed on contradictions coming up at the AAR, American Academy of Religion, because I think, yeah, like as scholars studying again these like politically abject groups, contradiction is something that we need to be approaching differently to make sure that we don't fall into those substantialist
and
yeah, sorry.
Just have a little question on this, and then maybe if we aim to understand it as functional relations, then you've often used the term produce interventions that will actually work.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Rather than just condemning them to, oh, they're just so wrong.
Exactly. Because if we're actually focusing on those relations instead of calling them contrasting things or calling them contradictions and walking away, then we're not actually, if we're doing that, then we're not actually focusing on what those relations are forming and how we might intervene in that formative process. So yeah, I hope that speaks to what you're thinking about, Rebecca. So I will keep thinking about it.
Thank you. And last, we have a Zoltan, and then that's our last point for the time we have. I'm conscious that people are joining from far away. At late at night. Sorry, go on, Santa.
Okay, gonna be brief to Chris's question whether relationism implies relativism. I have a go. My answer is no. It obviously has to do with a multitude of relative points of view, but here I'm going to reference Habermas and the fact that knowledge is always processual, so it's always a process, and it's intersubjective, and if you manage to keep thinking, reasoning within a non-authoritarian framework, involving universal equal participation and the rest, it is always tending toward something, a solution, a definition, concepts. There are, not objective in the pure sense of the word, but they provide a solution that's beneficial for everyone. I'm going to illustrate this with an example from law, a legal concept. The current definition of what a father is, in my country at least, is that when the parents of the newborn are married, then And we don't have same-sex marriage in this country. Yeah, this is the Orban regime. This is very reactionary. So it's not as complicated as in, say, Canada, Belgium, France, you name it. So when the newborn, the parents of the newborn are, it's a married couple, then automatically, from the legal point of view, the father of the child is the male spouse, the spouse of the mother. Okay. Now, imagine the future. Not the future. Speaking of speaking of present, it's not just theoretically, but technologically possible to get a DNA sample from everyone and resolve this question for good the day the child is born by, you know, taking a DNA sample from the newborn and comparing it to a huge database, including the DNA of several hundreds of millions of people. But is it the right thing to do? The only way to work this out is by appealing to the ethics of the question implied in the question. So it's, you know, intersubjective, involving a multitude of relative points of view, but it's you know, relationism. I would argue against the idea that relationism implies relativism. It sounds way too postmodern to me. Okay, that's my take.
Thank you. Thank you, Zoltan. And thank you, everyone, for your points. I don't know if you would like to respond to that briefly, Chris, or pose your...
I don't know. It's so interesting to hear the different questions. I threw out a whole bunch of questions. It's interesting to hear which ones clicked and sparked for different people, and also the different approaches that we all brought to it. So I'm really happy that everybody had that energy, and I hope for those of you who didn't speak that it was really interesting to be part of anyways. So yeah. That's all I kind of have for now. Thanks very much, everybody.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you for joining in this short. It's just a little taste of what will be coming. I'm going to stop the recording now.